Funding for this program has been provided in part by the U.S. Forest Service through a Wood Innovations grant and the Nevada Rangeland Resources Commission.
I come to really understand and know Cave Valley and Cave Valley Ranch for what it is, and it's an incredible place. It has incredible diversity of wildlife and big game and sage grouse and elk and deer and all those things that I've always loved my entire life. And so in 2010, I permanently left my job with the Department of Wildlife, and I've been here ever since. We've done 1,450-acre conservation easement with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and just countless, habitat improvement projects. But all at the same time, we are an operating cattle ranch. We produce Black Angus cattle. We try to provide the best product that we can in an open range environment. We take very much pride in that. But at the same time, we're very conscientious about how to manage the land and to get us through drought years, reducing numbers and know when to increase numbers and how to balance all that with the native habitat that's been here for eons and to improve upon that. As anywhere else in Nevada, Cave Valley is no exception. Pinyon and Juniper is encroaching on otherwise healthy ecosystems, sagebrush ecosystems. And in a combination with that, this ranch has old fire scars from lightning strikes and different things. It's caused concern for us for the PJ being so heavy adjacent to the ranch and on the ranch.
Over the years, PJ woodlands have expanded rapidly.
The middle of the 19th century, 1850, when the Little Ice Age ended, what we're standing in was almost entirely sagebrush. That south slope over there was not, that was trees. But out here, this was sagebrush. And as we got towards the end of the 19th century, the climate changes associated with global increase in global temperature set up conditions that made it very easy for tree seedlings to establish out into the sagebrush. And they did, in densities that equaled over the entire 20th century, that many trees established.
Research across the West and the world has shown a significant increase in the woody biomass over the past century as forests and woodlands have expanded and infilled. The Pinyon and Juniper woodlands of Nevada are no different. This change has come with a significant increase in fire fuel loading. Thinning or removing trees in a mosaic pattern can serve as a fire surrogate, break up fuel loads, improve wildlife habitat, and restore watersheds in a more orderly manner than uncontrolled catastrophic wildfire.
The problem is the Pinyon and Juniper has created such a heavy fuel load in a lot of these areas that when it does burn, it basically incinerates the ground and any viable native seed or plants that were there that could have come back in a normal situation. So what comes back? It's the most dominant, thriving plant that's in the neighborhood, and it's cheatgrass, and it thrives on fire. And so we made the decision to do initially a lop and drop treatment on the ranch that involves over 1,100 acres.
Lop and drop, or lop and scatter, as you'll sometimes hear it referred to, is a treatment type where essentially you're coming in and cutting the trees and leaving them right on site. So you're catching the trees early in that successional period and trying to favor the perennial grass and brush component of that ecosystem.
In doing so, we've noticed a number of benefits from that. There was one 80-acre section that we did that I had no idea that there was even a spring there until we actually took the trees down. And the following year, all of a sudden, we have a spring there in an otherwise dry piece of property. And so that spring has actually benefited elk and deer and just an array of wildlife.
As a woodland is establishing or reestablishing, in the case of post-fire, it really goes through three phases as it succeeds away from that disturbance or as it establishes. So a phase one woodland is really when you're getting some young trees into an area or reestablishing post-fire. In a phase one woodland, the perennial grasses and the brush component are dominating the site and the resources of that site. As you move into a phase 2 woodland, both your trees, your brush, and your grass species are more co-dominant in that situation. And so you'll see a real mix like we're standing in here. And then as you get into a phase 3 woodland, really what you're seeing is the trees have the competitive advantage. They're really starting to dominate the resources of a site, whether that be space, water, or nutrients in the soil. And you'll actually start seeing the understory plants, both the perennial grasses and in some cases the brush, start to die out as the trees take hold.
This is phase 1. And it was just a scattering of trees across here, but they were starting to approach that 4 to 5% cover. There is some studies where they've seen the sage grouse start to avoid these areas once the trees hit that cover. And the grouses have it ingrained in them to avoid any vertical structure, whether it's a tree or a power line or any building or something like that, because they just have that instinct to avoid those, mostly because of predator issues. So when you're looking at balancing, the funding and how many acres you can do, I'm a big proponent of doing a lot of this phase 1 stuff because it has not yet transitioned where we're losing a lot of the understory vegetation, but we are starting to impact the birds and wanting to avoid these areas because the trees are getting to a level where they just start to avoid it.
So as we talk about the encroachment and the infilling, those are two problems, because with the encroachment, you cause a sagebrush community in a wildfire situation to burn more intensely. And the same applies for the infilling. A site that might burn in a more mosaic pattern in a Pinyon Juniper community, as you have a lot of infilling, it doesn't burn in a mosaic pattern anymore, and it's very hot. And it means what we get back is not necessarily good. We totally lose the habitat for a long period of time. And if it converts to cheatgrass, then it may never recover again.
Eastern Nevada Landscape Coalition was started in 2001, so it has a number of years that it's been working, basically on restoring the ecosystems of the Great Basin to bring back biodiversity that has unfortunately been lost or has diminished, and also dealing with the impact of invasive plant species on the local ecosystems. In general, what is happening is because of climate change and because of the changes in the amount of rainfall and drought and whatnot, we're getting more and more fires that reach such an intensity that they basically sterilize an area totally. There's nothing left.
Climate change is the major factor driving the expansion of pinyon and juniper trees and their effect on other ecosystems.
Year 2000 is kind of the tipping point. After that, we have been regularly setting global temperature records. And we're now at temperature levels globally probably higher than we've had in 500 years. And as a result, since 2000, fire size, frequency, intensity has significantly increased. The area burned in high intensity has more than tripled. And everything in here now is all trees that have established during a pulse surge of expansion that occurred during the 20th century. And this has been recorded all across the Great Basin. Through the Little Ice Age, relatively constant rate of tree establishment in the 20th century just takes off. And most of the trees we have here are examples of that.
Cheatgrass now dominates the site.
I think more important than that dynamic is the climate, the warmer it gets, the more competitive cheatgrass becomes. The productivity of cheatgrass has increased by almost a third. Then you add in the temperature increase. That's 1/3 more fuels, 1/3 more competitive ability against the native perennials.
Prior to treatment on public lands, areas are studied and analyzed through a detailed scientific process.
So the process is that as we come up to a watershed, we begin the assessment phase with an ID team. And the first part of that is that we'll take all the monitoring data we have across all the programs and that's available to us to identify what we can learn about the landscape. From there, we complete the assessment of the watershed, include the public through the process to kind of determine where the health and function of that watershed is at. And this is for all land uses as well as vegetative communities and everything else within the watershed. So for instance, the watershed we're in here is the South Steptoe watershed. It's a little over 200,000 acres. Through the assessment and implementation plan, we use a metric called the fire regime condition class, which is broken into 3 condition classes. Our objective is to get closer to the FRCC1, which is characterized as a 33% departure from that reference condition. And the theory is once you approach that FRCC1, natural processes can start to take over and manage the landscape and maintain its function. In treatment design, our overall objective is to try and mimic what a natural disturbance would have done across the landscape. We're planning our treatments to leave, stringers and islands and fingers, not just for wildlife habitat, but to represent kind of what would have occurred on the landscape if a natural event were to have come through. But the objective of the watersheds is to manage the landscape for a balanced landscape. If we manage the landscape providing for all the different cirroclasses of vegetation that are identified in the reference condition, it'll provide all the niches for the wildlife that's needed on its own.
Mastication is another method for removing pinyon and juniper.
So a mastication treatment really is more shredding or a grinding of the tree. Essentially what you're doing there is you're taking the biomass from a standing state, basically chipping that tree oftentimes right in place and then scattering the chips on the ground.
This was a mastication treatment where none of the biomass was utilized. The grinding head attached to a track has come in and ground these trees. The biomass has just been spread out to naturally decay. It forms this layer of chips and dead pieces of vegetation on the ground. Some of it acts as a snow catch and kind of helps with some of the regeneration as long as the chip layer doesn't get too thick on it.
I know that there's people that argue that we're eliminating an ecosystem through the pinyon juniper woodlands. But after an intense fire through that, what comes after that? Cheatgrass. And it's a vicious cycle once that gets going. It's really, really difficult to try and restore back after cheatgrass has become established. So I think we need to avoid that at all costs.
We'll monitor pretty intensively for at least 10 years on a 3-year interval. Continue to look for efficiencies where we can do things better, both on the landscape and within our own internal processes, working with strong partners that have the same objectives that we can help work off of each other to maybe get more done and be more efficient, to learn from each of the treatments that we do, but always making forward progress as we're going ahead. Not doing something isn't really an option. We need to keep making progress on these watersheds or landscapes and keep learning as we go along.
And what we're showing in the monitoring in general is that we're seeing successful treatments. There is almost, in many cases, an immediate response from that sagebrush community when we remove those trees.
Biomass, in a purely layman's term, is really the material that you remove when you do a treatment. And that's everything from the trunk and the stumps to the needles and the leaves. I think the biggest thing is when we talk about fuels reduction, the advantage of utilizing that biomass is it does take the fuels off of the site. Rather than rearranging the fuels on site, you're removing it. So there's really no shortage of products or markets that you could make or sell to with pinyon and juniper. Really the challenge is how do you make utilization economic?
Working with the Pinyon Juniper Partnership and other partners, we've been looking at some of those markets where we could potentially take some of these trees that we've cut and find an end use for them. And there's a whole host of things, but one of the things we've done here is you can see the sacks behind me, those are full of biochar. And we had a company out of Salt Lake City named Amaron Energy, and they had a mobile pyrolysis unit. It's a big kiln, and that kiln heats the wood at a very high temperature in the absence or very low oxygen environment. And what you get out of that is end products of, there's biogas that burns off the top out of the unit. There's bio-oil that you can collect as a potentially end market product, and then there's biochar. And it's essentially a 100% carbon charcoal product, and there's been a lot of research done on it throughout the world. A key to the utilization solution we're looking at is the transportation portion of that, and so that was the whole reason we wanted to bring that mobile unit out here, because you look at a lot of these feasibility studies, they're looking at how they could use some of this material, and it's always the transportation costs just really cause a lot of issues and make many things unfeasible. So the idea was if we brought that unit here, that what we'd be shipping from this location would be the end product, would be the biochar itself. So in concept, a very good idea. And the unit itself, the pyrolysis kiln that was within the unit worked great. And it's primarily used as a soil amendment where you add it into the soils to help increase the soil moisture capacity. There's about 26,000 acres of irrigated alfalfa and grass hay that's grown in this valley. And they're facing a lot of water shortages. And we're also facing the potential of having water rights cut off because there's too many water rights than there is Mother Nature providing water. And so we've been also looking at what do we do with some of this ag land when it's no longer under active irrigation. And we saw some of the soil amendments like biochar as a potential solution to help increase the soil moisture of those ag soils so you could grow something that didn't have to be irrigated. It would hold that moisture and it would broaden the types of plants that we could grow in those areas once water rights or water was pulled off of those plots.
When we're making compost, we're trying to find as many diverse feedstocks as we can. Some of those would be carbon-based, like wood chips, including PJ. Some would be hays or agricultural waste, and then we find green materials like grass clippings, food waste, manures to all blend together. The key with successful composting is the most diverse recipe possible. So when it comes specifically to pinyon juniper, wonderful feedstock, the biggest hurdle is just being able to blend the PJ with other feedstocks, meaning if we need to bring in giant quantities of PJ to a composting site, you have to have equal or more of other feedstock items to blend with it to make the recipe correct. So when it comes to biochar, we were able to get the biochar from Eureka that was made, and we incorporated it into cooking compost windrows, where we did different weight-driven test trials on how much biochar we put into compost to see if we would see, one, nutrient density differences, and two, if we saw water holding differences. We did see as you increased biochar in the compost itself, the testing came back with more moisture in the compost, meaning that if the same amount of water was added to all three different windrows with different varying levels of biochar in each one, the one with the most biochar had the most moisture holding capacity. What we're hoping for is when they go back onto the field, that we are able to see those increases, one, in the overall nutrient density of the soil itself and potentially in the production value of the crops that are being grown in that soil, that you can use less water.
So this compost pile that I'm standing on was made in western Nevada. It was pinyon juniper trees removed here from the Diamond Range in Diamond Valley. Those trees were chipped, and then the chips were hauled across the state to a composting facility, Full Circle Compost, and they made the compost over a period of a few months. One of our first loads of compost, most of that material went to lots in the town of Eureka, where the EPA was doing contaminated soils removal of lead contaminated soil. Then another load of compost we received, the material was applied on this alfalfa field that's behind me here to test how it would react in the soils as far as holding soil moisture and more yield from the plant and potentially reducing irrigation needs.
With every 1% increase in overall organic matter in Nevada soils, you get 25,000 gallons of water holding capacity in the soil. Most Nevada soils are at 1 to 2%. You want to be at 5. So you can save anywhere from 75,000 to 100,000 gallons of water to the acre. That's huge, especially moving into our drought that we're kind of going into right now.
The Nevada Division of Forestry is also researching how to use PJ biomass. Julian Pellegrini is their biomass utilization coordinator.
What I've been lately looking at is large trunk trees, whole trunk trees that are such as Jeffrey pine, that sort of thing out of the Sierras, to be used as aesthetic products, wood products, to be sold to the public. And I think that there's a certain amount of potential with pinyon juniper for that as well. Juniper wood, for instance, is beautiful wood. But we have an Alaska mill, it's a long bar chainsaw mill that we can use to slab some of this wood to make live edge tabletops, chairs, picture frames, all kinds of stuff. And we have jail inmates that are trained to use that equipment, including large sanding machines.
So one advantage of biomass utilization and even the proactive treatment is there's a lot of work that goes into the planning and the environmental clearance when you're talking about the planning side of a project. And then, of course, once you implement that project, you've got to bring folks in who know how to implement the project the right way, whether that's woodcutters and sawyers who do a lop and scatter, or folks that run the heavy equipment. And that's either jobs in the community permanently through the agencies that are planning, or that's folks that come in from out of town that are spending hotel nights and dollars in those local communities.
Part of what we're looking at is establishing a biomass market here where you could have things from, the raw wood product for firewood as well as setting up some composting facilities on this side of the state to service some of these agricultural communities, home gardeners, trying to keep it local. So we're reducing the hazardous fuels, we're benefiting sage grouse, mule deer habitat. All of that provides additional water back to this basin, and then applying this actually in Diamond Valley to increase the water use efficiency here. It's all a big, complex issue, but to try to solve many of our resource concerns from many different perspectives.
Gist of it is, over the last 150 years, most of these woodlands, between the climate changes and the influx of seedlings over the 20th century, fuel loads are completely different. And now our environmental conditions are completely different, resulting in far more frequent conditions, what we're now calling red flag conditions, in which all of this are subject to burning.
We are creating a fuel break. So this helps out rural towns when they actually get fire. So the meaning behind this is to create the fuel break from anything getting over into the WUI area, which is wildland urban interface. We are creating that fuel break so we can have a jump on the fire, whether it's back burns with our engines or aircraft.
After this type of treatment, there is an opportunity to manage for a better return of the native plants.
So with the understory, we come through with the seeding process, try to bring in the native grass. It also helps out with the wildlife. The one thing that we are trying to mitigate as well, along with bringing in the native grass, is cheatgrass. That's been our biggest proponent for carrying fire. It's very continuous. So in this area, the ground fuels are very sparse. As far as like wildlife coming through, they go quite a ways to find any type of food. So where we actually try to seed and bring in the native grasses again, it kind of helps out along with the wildlife and making the area look a little bit more appealing.
These treatments, they're getting a lot of use from the wildlife. Obviously we have other limiting factors like water, such as in this drought, but just the qualitative assessment, we're seeing a lot of use from ungulates as well as sagebrush obligate, sage grouse. A lot of nesting birds are using these treatments. A lot of them are actually using the slash to nest in. This site kind of represents our transition from the sagebrush communities up into mountain brush, mountain mahogany type sites. Right here we're just looking at mountain mahogany. As this unit rolls over this ridge, we get a lot more mountain brush, serviceberry, mountain mahogany, things like that. So our objectives here were to remove the Pinyon and Juniper canopy layer that was overtopping the mountain mahogany as well as the understory species, and to have that release. This treatment was completed just a couple months ago before we entered wildlife restrictions, so the understory hasn't really had a chance to respond yet, and the current drought isn't helping that, but I do think that it will respond well and we'll have a good response from the understory vegetation here. We're already seeing a lot of wildlife coming in and using, the sprouts and things that are coming up and relying on that.
The various phases of PJ encroachment help determine management and fire risk.
I like to use the tree dominance index. Tree cover divided by total vegetation cover. Phase 3, tree cover is more than 2/3 of the total. Phase 2, tree cover is 1/3 to 2/3 of the total vegetation cover. Phase 1 tree cover is less than 1/3 of total vegetation cover. You can have a whole bunch of little trees invade out into the sagebrush and then stop. For a few years you'll be phase 1. As those trees grow, you transition into phase 2. As they keep growing, you may even transition into phase 3. Phase 1, you're primarily burning the understory. And if you've got a good herbaceous component there, particularly bunch grasses, the large ones, you can get a good response. You can get a good recovery from that fire. By the time you get to phase 3 and full tree dominance, there's very little understory left to respond after the fire, and that's just open season for sheetgrass.
Old growth pinyon and juniper present a different fire dynamic and possibly a different treatment for the tree's survival.
This is an old growth, most of it. There has been some infilling, but there's a lot of old trees in here. These are all pre-settlement trees, except for the infilling. There's trees in here I think are easily over 300 years old. The infill is adding a lot of fuels to carry a fire that otherwise would not be here. The trees would otherwise be fairly spaced, but all these infilling trees through here are adding fuels that could carry a crown fire.
Dr. Tausch suggests a novel treatment approach be considered to prevent fire from destroying these old-growth PJ forests.
Pick some areas with fairly decent old trees in them. Take out the surged expansion trees that came in primarily during the 20th century, except maybe for one here and there if there's one of these older trees that's dying, to replace it. It may be the best native-dominated ecosystem we have left that could potentially hold off both fire and cheatgrass for some period of time. Large trees far enough apart to avoid crown fire, still close enough that they're dominant enough to keep the herbaceous fuels out of the understory. You can see that's largely happening in here. There's hardly even cheatgrass under these.
In the 10 years since we've started the partnership, one of the exciting things is just how much more information we have about the PJ woodlands, not only their history and why they're in the condition they're in now, but things that can really help with management going forward.
It's really important, if we've already made this investment, to continue forward with it. And I think that if it's also documented and published, that will be even better as well.
In the face of unprecedented climate change, and in the absence of some level of management, the end result following catastrophic wildfire is cheatgrass-dominated monoculture. However, using the best available science and monitoring to inform management, we can design treatments that mimic historic natural processes, such as smaller, less intensive fire, and create more resilient ecosystems that maintain both pinyon and juniper, but in a better balance with the other key perennial grasses and shrubs.
Partnerships are second to none when it comes to projects on a landscape scale. There's no way a landowner can do projects like this on their own.
The partnership itself has always been founded on 3 core pillars: to promote sound proactive management of the PJ woodlands, to make sure that those management actions and prescriptions are based in sound science and followed up on with monitoring pre and post treatment. Really what we're looking for is a reduction in that fuel load, so if a fire does come through, it has more of a natural response. Often if you're looking for the habitat components, your hope is that when the trees come out and they're no longer dominating that site, that you see a release from your perennial understory that's left, so your perennial grasses and forbs, as well as your native plant species. You're really hoping that they pick up those free resources and regenerate themselves.